Ta-da!
We may now move on to the shooting phase. During your warband shooting phase, each of your warriors may shoot once with one of his weapons. This means that he can fire a bow, shoot with a crossbow, or hurl a throwing knife, for example. In addition, within the shooting phase, we will also be able to cast spells. We will touch upon those at the end of this discussion of shooting. To begin, the shooting team now selects one of its figurines that will be shooting, and it picks out a target that it will be shooting at. We then figure out hits and wounds, and then move on to our next one and pick out a target, figure out hits and wounds, and then go to our last one. And in this way, we will go through each of our models one at a time. Each model can shoot once in the shooting phase, so long as he can see a target and assuming he has a suitable weapon. A model may not fire in the following circumstances: if he is engaged in hand-to-hand combat, such as is the case here; if he has run or failed a charge in the movement phase; if he has rallied this turn; or if he is stunned or knocked down, such as is the case here. In this particular situation, then, the only model able to fire is going to be this archer right here. To shoot at a target, a model must be able to see it, and the only way to check this is to stoop over the tabletop for a model's eye view. So come down here and look from this archer's view. You can see all around him 360 degrees. You may turn the model in any way whatsoever, but it's important that you move from the eyes of the archer to the target. If you can draw a line of sight, then you are able to fire. Some gamers even find it helpful to use a laser in this situation, so you can trace from the head, the eyes of the archer right over to the target for its shot. Closest target. When standing on ground level, you must shoot at the closest enemy, as he represents the most immediate threat and therefore the most obvious target. So in this case, if we have a choice between these two orcs, this archer will have to shoot over on that guy. An exception to this rule is that you may shoot at a more distant target if it is easier to hit, or if closer models are stunned or knocked down. So for example, we have a knocked down model here, so we do not have to fire at that one in that he does not represent a threat. This guy over here is behind cover, which makes him more difficult to hit, and this guy over here is in the open, so he actually is the easiest shot. So we may in fact shoot at him even though he is the furthest away. A good rule of thumb for this kind of shooting is simply this: always shoot first at the model that represents the greatest threat, and then fire away at the model that is the easiest to hit. And once again, it is possible to shoot at models that are knocked down or stunned, but you may also ignore them to try and shoot at a more immediate threat. Just as with fantasy, you may not shoot at models that are in hand-to-hand combat because the risk of hitting your own guy is too high. The rules for shooting, however, are slightly different if you have an elevated position more than 2 inches off of the ground, whether you are on a building, a plankway, in a tower, etc. In this case, when you are elevated in this manner, the shooter may shoot at any target that he or she desires. Cover. The many walls, ruined buildings, and other masonry in Mordheim offer plenty of cover. If any portion of the target is hidden by a piece of scenery or another model, the shooting model will suffer a penalty as explained below. So in this case, were our archer to be shooting here, this model would have no cover whatsoever, and that model would be considered having cover, so a -1 shooting penalty would apply. It is important to remember that it does not matter how much of the target is in cover. The model that is shooting always suffers a -1 to hit modifier. So in the case of these two orcs, even if this guy on the right only has a part of a leg and a torso under cover, he still receives the same -1 benefit as the other orc. Once again, in cases like these, it is important to get down and actually look from the view of the model itself to see if the targets are in fact in cover or not. Once again, were our model to have an elevated position more than 2 inches above the ground, he is free to fire at any target that he so chooses. The one exception to this rule is if there is an enemy model in the same building. So for example, this archer will need to be firing at that orc. Once again, there's no pre-measuring in Mordheim, so once you take your archer and you select your target, you then have to measure the distance to make sure that that target is within the maximum range of the weapon. If the target is within the range of the weapon, we can proceed with hitting and wounding. If not, we say that this attack actually misses. To determine whether a shot hits its target, roll a d6. The dice score needed will depend upon how good a shot the firer is, as indicated by his ballistic skill. The chart that we give you here shows the minimum d6 roll needed to score a hit. In this case, we'll say that our archer did not move. He is within short range, and this guy has no cover. He is out in the open. Now, our archer has a ballistic skill of 3, which means he needs to get a 4 on a d6 to hit. And there's a 1, that is a miss. Here now are a few of the hit modifiers that change how difficult it is to strike your target. First, if the target is obscured by any kind of scenery or other models, then it counts as being in cover, and there is a -1 modifier. That means where we were hitting on 4s before, if this were the case, we'd be hitting on 5s. Say now that our archer is in long range, which is over half the distance of the weapon. Then we also receive a -1 modifier. So in this case, we'd also be hitting on 5s. Third, perhaps in the movement phase, we had moved our archer. In that case, we also suffer a -1 penalty for moving and shooting. So we will be hitting on 5s. It is also possible to combine these. So say we moved in the movement phase, which gives us a -1 modifier, and we were shooting over here at this guy behind cover, that's another -1 modifier. So whereas we would be hitting on 4s normally, we will be now hitting on 6s. Now in Mordheim, unlike Fantasy, there's no such thing as hitting on 7s. Some players, however, who play Fantasy like to use that rule. And the reason for that is it allows you a chance to hit even when things are very difficult. So for example, if we were in long range and we moved and this guy had covers, we would be hitting on 7s. And the way to figure out if you hit on a 7 is to roll a d6. If you get a 6 on your first roll, you re-roll that, and anything 4, 5, or 6 will count as a 7. Now, hittings on 7s is not an official rule for Mordheim, so make sure that you talk with your opponent before the game begins to see whether or not you want to use this fantasy rule. Modifiers, however, need not always be negative. In this case, we also have a +1 hit modifier if you are shooting at a large target. So the main body of the target needs to be more than 2 inches tall or wide, and this includes such targets as buildings and large creatures like ogres. So in this example, if we have not moved and we are in short range, we will say that this ogre, we would normally be hitting on 4s, but now because he is a large target, we will be hitting on 3s. And there's a hit. Roll to wound. Once you have hit a target, test to see if a wound is inflicted. A shot may fail to cause a wound because it hits part of the target's equipment, just scratches the skin, or causes some very minor injury, which the warrior bravely or stupidly ignores. If you fail to cause a wound, the target is unharmed. For shooting now, the way to determine whether your shot has caused a wound, what you need to do is compare the strength of the weapon with the toughness of the target. In our case, in this example, we have a strength 3 for the bow, and we have a toughness 4 for the orc. Once we know these, we will have to go to the wound chart. What you want to do is on the left side, locate the weapon strength, in this case a 3, and then go to the top and locate the target's toughness, in this case a 4. You are then able to trace these to the point where they intersect, and you will see that in order to wound, you will need a 5. Rolling to wound, and that's a 6. And a 6 is a very good roll because it is what in Mordheim is called a critical hit. Let's talk about that now. If you roll a 6 when rolling to wound for hand-to-hand combat and shooting only, you will cause what is called a critical hit. Roll a d6 and consult the critical hit chart below to determine the damage caused by the critical hit. You should also roll to see whether the target makes its armor save or suffers damage as normal. So for this case, let's consult the critical hit chart and roll it out. And we get a 1, which hits a vital part. In this case, the wound is doubled to 2 wounds. Roll any armor saves before doubling the wound. Let's say for the sake of argument that our orc has light armor on, so he will save on a 6, and he saves the wound so it does not go through. Now were he not to make the save, we would then roll 2 dice to see what the injuries are. In this case we got a 2 and a 3. When looking at injuries then, we look over at the injury chart. In this case, a 2 means that our guy is knocked down, and a 3 means that he is stunned. You will always take the more powerful of the attacks. So in this case, we will say that our guy is stunned, and we will place him face down. There are a couple important things to remember with critical hits. If the attacker normally needs 6 to wound his target, he cannot cause a critical hit. His opponent is simply too tough to suffer a serious injury at the hands of such a puny creature. And in addition, each warrior may only cause 1 critical hit in each hand-to-hand combat phase. See the close combat section for more details about this. So if he has several attacks, the first 6 you roll to wound will cause a critical hit, and none of the others will. So if we return back to the critical hit chart, you can see that the higher the number, the better the effect. So first of all, 1, 2 means you hit a critical part. You double the wounds, but armor saves are allowed. 3 to 4, you hit an exposed spot. The wound is doubled to 2 wounds, but the attack ignores all armor saves. And best of all is 5 to 6, the Master Strike. The wound is doubled to 2 wounds. The attack ignores all armor saves, and you gain +2 to any injury rolls. So for example, if you were to roll 2 1s, that would be 2 3s instead. A note about armor. Armor can be very expensive, but it can also be good to save your warriors a lot of problems. If your warrior is wearing armor and he suffers a wound, roll a d6. If the dice roll is sufficiently high, the wounding hit has bounced off the armor and has not hurt the wearer at all. The dice score required varies according to the type of armor. So, for example, here are a few of the most common kinds of armor. If your warrior has light armor, he is able to roll a 6 to save a wound. If your warrior has heavy armor, he's able to roll a 5 to save the wound. And if your warrior has gromril armor, he is able to roll a 4 to save the wound. And of course, a shield will add 1 additional point to that save. So for example, if you have light armor, you would normally get a 6 save. But if you have light armor and a shield, you will save on a 5 or a 6. Armor save modifiers. Some weapons are better at penetrating armor than others. A shot from a bow, for example, can be deflected relatively easy. As we see in this example, this bow has a strength of 3, and that's not strong enough to actually modify any of the armor. Say, for example, however, that we have a pistol, and say this pistol was strength 4. This would then be a -1 save modifier to the armor. So if we say in this case that the orc has light armor and he suffers a wound from this pistol, which is strength 4, we would then say that that negates the armor save and means that he gets no such save. And as you see when we go down this chart, the higher the strength of the weapon, the greater the minus save modifier. So a strength 4 will be -1, strength 5 -2, strength 6 -3, strength 7 -4, strength 8 -5, 9 plus -6. And as we will come back to in the combat section, these armor modifiers even apply to hand-to-hand combat. So for example, if this ogre is attacking with a strength 4, for example, that would still give a -1 modifier to the light armor of this orc. Injuries. Most models now have a wounds characteristic of 1, but some have a value of 2 or more. If the target has more than 1 wound, then deduct 1 from his total each time he suffers a wound. Make a note on the roster sheet. So long as the model has at least 1 wound remaining, he may continue to fight. Another good way to mark wounds is simply to add a dice next to the figurine that says how many wounds are remaining. As soon as the fighter's wounds are reduced to 0, roll to determine the extent of his injuries using the injury chart. The player who inflicted the wound rolls a d6 for the wound that reduced the model to 0 wounds, and for every wound the model receives after that. If a model suffers several wounds in one turn, roll once for each of them and apply the highest result. So for example, this guy right here has only 1 wound. Say that we actually wound him. We will now determine his extent of injury. Let's roll a d6 and compare it to the chart. A 6 is out of action. So what that means then is that we will remove the guy from the playing field. A 1 or 2 means that he is knocked down, so we place him on his back to show that. On a roll of 3-4, we have stunned the target. He falls to the ground where he lies wounded and barely conscious. Turn the model face down to show that he has been stunned. And again, on a 5 or 6, we remove the model as out of action. Knock down models. A model that has been knocked down, such as this orc, has fallen down or has a jarring blow, which means that he is unable to get up immediately. So we turn the model face up to show that he has been knocked down. Now, during the movement phase, a knockdown model may crawl up to 2 inches during the movement phase, but he may not fight in hand-to-hand combat, shoot, or cast any spells. If the knockdown figurine is in base contact with an enemy, a knockdown model can crawl 2 inches away only if the enemy is engaged in hand-to-hand combat with another opponent. Otherwise, he has to stay where he is. In this case, the archer is fighting another orc, so he may crawl away 2 inches. Were there no other combat, the orc would need to stay here where he is. In combat, the knockdown figurine cannot strike back, and the enemy will have a good chance of putting him out of action. We'll explain this a little bit more when we talk about the Warriors Knockdown section of the Close Combat Rules. At the start of the orc's next turn, a warrior who has been knocked down may stand up during the recovery phase, but what that means is that he may move at half rate, shoot, and cast spells, but he cannot charge or run. So in this case, were these two not engaged in combat, and were he to stand up, he would then be able to move half of his movement rate, he would be able to shoot and cast spells. Were he, however, to stand up into hand-to-hand combat, this would mean that he would not be able to move away, and he will automatically strike last, irrespective of weapons or initiative. In the next round after this, the fighter moves and fights normally, even though he has 0 wounds left. If the model takes any further wounds, then roll once again on the injury chart to see exactly what kind of injury the model sustains. Stunned warriors. When a warrior is stunned, he is either badly injured or temporarily knocked out. Turn the model face down to show that he has been stunned. A fighter who is stunned may do nothing at all. A player may turn the model face up in the next recovery phase, and the warrior is then treated as being knocked down. Out of action. A warrior who is out of action is also out of the game. Remove the model from the tabletop. It's impossible to tell at this point whether the warrior is alive or dead, but for game purposes it makes no difference at this stage. Simply remove the piece and we will figure out what happens to him at the end of the game. A brief word about magic. Different kinds of wizards use different kinds of magic. So, for example, Sisters of Sigmar and warrior priests use the magic type Prayers of Sigmar. Necromancers use the type of magic Necromancy. At the start of games, each wizard starts with one randomly determined spell, but they may gain more. Roll a d6 and consult the appropriate chart to see which spell it is. If you get the same spell twice, if you have the ability for 2 spells, roll again or lower the spell's difficulty by 1. So for example, if we say for this example that what we have here is a Skaven Eshin sorcerer, we will look at the table for Magic of the Horned Rat and roll a d6. And with a roll of a 6, we will get the Sorcerer's Curse. This spell has a difficulty of 6, and it has a range of 12 inches and affects a single model within range. The target must re-roll any successful armor saves and to hit rolls during the Skaven hand-to-hand phase and his own next shooting and hand-to-hand combat phases. Let's run through an example now of casting a spell. Remember now that spells are cast in the shooting phase, and they can be used even if the caster is in hand-to-hand combat. To use a spell, the wizard must roll equal to or greater than the spell's difficulty score on a 2d6. If we remember now, the Sorcerer's Curse had a difficulty of 6, and we will now cast it from this sorcerer over here onto this orc using 2d6. 5 was not equal to or greater than the difficulty, so we will say that this spell has failed. Had we rolled something like a 9, this would have been successful, which means the spell would have gone off, and this orc then would need to reroll any successful armor saves and to hit rolls during the Skaven hand-to-hand phase and his own next shooting and hand-to-hand combat phases. A wizard may cast one spell per turn and may not use missile weapons if he wants to cast a spell. He can, however, run and cast spells. Some spells cause direct damage and are resolved the same way as damage from shooting or blows in hand-to-hand combat. Spells do not cause critical hits. Models always receive armor saves against wounds caused by spells unless noted otherwise.